Hello and welcome to session 11, VBC Setup Strategies. In this session we'll be looking at setup strategies and best practices for the VBC. Okay, the first thing I want to notice is that I'm actually logged in as admin, and this means, as you probably already aware, that it gives me administrator privileges. And this is something that is common across all computer systems. Particularly if you're managing computer systems, you will have an admin login or a root login, something similar to that. However, I am logged in because I need to change some things, but it is not the first good practice is not to log in as an administrator unless you absolutely need to. So the first principle is to generate some user IDs so that to give people privileges which are more more appropriate to the job they're doing. If they don't need to change things, then they don't need write access, they only need read access. So let's have a look at adding a user. So we go down to the main part of the VBC menu on the left, and we can see some additional menu items that are not available to read-only users. There are a couple of reasons why you should give individual users individual login names. Let's go to Sites and Users, and we go to Users. So this particular VBC doesn't have that many users. So we will set up a user now and show you how it works. So we have users, we generate a new user, so let's add a new user, then we'll call it training. And we'll just set a password, training. And then we give that a user group. We'll come on to user groups in a minute, but let's just for now select restricted. And do we allow users to see all of the stream groups, or do we only allow them to see one of the stream groups that we've set up? For example, I'm in the UK at the moment. I might be administering a UK monitoring system that deals with a broadcaster that covers the whole of the UK. But I might want my engineers, my network engineers who are up in, say, Scotland, in Glasgow, I might only want them to see the streams that are involved in Glasgow, and I might only want them to see the probes which are in Glasgow, unless perhaps they're a network administrator and then they can see the entire system. So it's not just about read and write privileges, it's about what they can and cannot see. So we'll say all streams for now, but then we'll say that they can only see a VB330 and they can only see the VB120 and the VB220. So we add that to those sites, and then we add a new user. So now we've got a user called training who has restricted access to just 3 sites. So if I go back to my monitoring, you can see that I've got multiple sites here that I can see as my admin. So if I log out and log back in again as training, all right, okay, so now we can see that when we look at the overall monitoring summary screen, I can only see those 3 sites. Not only can I only see those 3 sites, I can only see streams that are associated with those 3 sites, and I can only see errors that are associated with those 3 sites. So it is really a way of limiting the view, and this might be applicable if your VBC is used by people not in your organisation. Then that is another way of limiting what they can and can't see. So I'm going to log out and I'm going to log back in again as admin, because I want to show you that we have a login history for all users here. Now you can see where demo logged in. I can see demo logged in from this IP address and at this time and date. This gives you an audit trail of who has logged in, where and when. So just for example, maybe some change has been done on a VBC or to a probe, and that wasn't authorized, or it didn't do what it was expected to do. Some change has been made to the VBC and you need to find out who did it and why. Because there may be a very good reason why that person made a change. So this audit trail gives you an ability to actually track back. If you know the time that something has happened, you can go back and see. So a probe was rebooted, perhaps. You'll know exactly when it was rebooted. Then you can go and see who was logged in at that time. And it also gives me a list of all the currently logged in users. Now remember that this public URL is available to anyone, all of our business partners. In fact, anyone who has any interest in Bridgetech monitoring can web browse to this URL and log in as demo. Let's have a look at demo and see what demo can actually do. So we look at the demo, we edit it. We can see the password. Well, we can't see the password because the number of dots does not signify the number of letters. We know because that would give someone a clue as to what to guess. And of course, most business partners know that the login name is demo and the user password is also demo. And it's restricted. They can see all streams, but they cannot see all sites. So there are some sites that they can't see. So what are these user groups? Well, they basically allow users, the VBC users, to set up user groups with specific privileges. So we've got an admin group, which of course is not read-only, but has every other privilege. Then we have a normal, then we have privileged, which is basically the same as admin, except it's not admin. User 1 has got the ability to access probes and see the transport stream service view, and manage devices for own sites only. In other words, the sites that we've allocated, they can manage the devices for those sites, but none other. And it's read-only. So we can see that by adding, we can say we could have a training group, and then we could say it's read-only, and we could say they can't manage all the sites, they can't do any management there, but they can see the transport stream view, for example, and then that would work. I'm not going to apply that because I don't want to stray. So best practice number 1, in fact, probably one of the most important best practices is to make sure that users have, that if they don't necessarily need to have, every single user has to have its own login, although that is very helpful, and it only takes minutes to set up, as you can see. Certainly some generic logins for, say, Glasgow MCR, Glasgow NOC. So they could all log in as Glasgow NOC and just see the Glasgow user profile. So that is really important. Don't give people admin. In fact, there's only one person who should have admin privileges, and even if you want to give someone else admin privileges, then give them another name like this privileged group name, and then get them to log in that way. So that shows you how to set up users, and users really important to be able to manage effectively a monitoring system. The other thing that's actually on this tab is the sites tab, and we've seen sites because we saw how to allocate sites to particular users. Well, sites are just user-defined names. You can see I've got a site called training, and I can edit that site, and really all it does is it just gives me a name and a description. And then I need to allocate one or more probes to that site, because unless I allocate one or more probes, then the site doesn't appear. So when I log in, so I'm logged in as admin, I can see all of my sites. There is a probe in training. So if I go back to sites and add a new site, but don't put a probe in it, so let's add a new, so let me say Temp. So we've got a site called Temp, and it's just a temporary site. So we'll add that as new, and there it is at the bottom, edit site. So I can go along to my user profile, and I can add to all 20 sites because all of my sites are actually in there. all of my sites, including Temp, are already in there. But when I actually go to my monitoring view, there is no site called Temp because it doesn't have a probe associated with it. Now, where you associate probes with sites is here. So I could pick a training probe and I can add that to site Temp if I want to. So this gives you the ability to call sites something that are meaningful to your particular organisation or your customer's organisation. Now you can see that we actually have sites that are based on physical attributes of the probe. So we've got RF probes, we've got an OTT probe, we've got micro VB site, a 330 site, a 288 site. Now, there's nothing stopping you calling those sites anything you want them to be. You could say, for example, going back to the UK, I could say I've got a site called Glasgow, a site called Edinburgh, a site called London, a site called Southampton. Or in Oslo, in Norway, I could have sites, different cities. And the probes that are in those cities for a distributed monitoring system, or they could be transmitter sites. They could be transmitter sites around the country, and you could have one site per transmitter. So it's very easy to allocate sites with probes, and that makes the monitoring overview something that is meaningful to an individual customer. It gives them this is the very top level of organisation for probes. Again, best practice, make sure the sites are meaningful and they have a relevance to the customer's operation. Of course, the next thing down the line, the next organisational practice is stream groups. Now, stream groups give you the ability, unsurprisingly, to associate multicast streams and OTT streams into groups that make sense. Now you can see we've got some weird and wonderful names here. First of all, we've got all streams, and that is a default. So all 350 multicast and OTT streams in this particular monitoring system are contained within all streams, and every single error in all of those streams is all joined together. So we're seeing a major alarm that has been 4 days in the operation of. Because of course the micro timeline, let's just make that a little bit bigger. The micro timeline is a 4-day window on all streams. Then we've got an ASI group, we've got a channel 52 group, whatever these mean. COFDM, well that's a bit more understandable. We've got all of our streams which are associated with our COFDM streams. We've got a demo stream group and an HD services stream group. We've even got a media core stream group for some reason. But the point is that these can be decided by the user into something that makes sense for their operation. Again, best practices is to configure the VBC to make sense of the operational organisation of the customer where it's installed. That's the reason that this ability, this configuration, is up to the customer so that they can actually make sense. So stream groups, we can see the stream groups down here. Premium, SD services. If we look at the stream view, then basically we see all of the streams unless we pick one of the stream groups. And there's the COFDM stream group that we saw. Oh, well, that's not very many, one. But then we looked at media core. See, these have been none at all, so we could delete that in fact. So let's look at our HD services. So again, this gives the customer the ability to very quickly go to streams that he's interested in for a particular issue. Maybe it's not a problem, maybe he just wants to see them. So stream groups are here. Let's go back to all streams. And stream groups are very simply added here in exactly the same way as users and sites were added. You just add a new stream group. You give it a name, give it a description. Do I make this available to all users? If it's ticked, then all users will see it. If it's not ticked, then they will only see stream groups that are available for the probes to which they have access. And then you basically, let's find something that means something, and then you can shift click or you can control click, and you can just move up and down and add those streams. So it's very easy. I'm not going to add new because I haven't given it a name for a start. And we do have some. So we had that one that had, if we look at, what was the one we saw? Media call. Let's look at media call and edit it. So there are no streams. So I'm going to take an executive decision now and I'm just going to delete that. Now, of course, where I logged in as demo, I wouldn't be, for a start, I wouldn't be able to see this menu, but I certainly wouldn't be able to delete any stream groups. So again, another reason for giving users specific privileges. I could create havoc on this VBC by deleting all manner of things. And that's one reason we don't give casual users any privileges, and we restrict the demo user to read only. So stream groups, fairly straightforward. Add them to enable users to gather all of the multicast streams and OTT streams into a format, into an organization that makes sense. So again, best practices. Now, there is an option on VBC, and if I go to the VBC About and look at license, exactly the same as a probe, there are licenses enabling you to have certain features that are not available in the standard VBC package, and these are basically the options that are available. We're licensed to have 1,000 blades. We do have the transport stream service view, and we have the graphics display, and we have the remote data wall option. So these are licensable options. So we do have the transport stream service view. Now what the transport stream service view gives is it gives a view of all of the services inside a transport stream, an MPTS for example. When we're looking at multicasts in an IPTV system or a head end, we very often see single program transport streams or SPTSs. And one multicast will contain one service or one stream or one channel, whatever you want to call it. However, there are certain places where MPTSs are more readily seen. For example, the output from a multiplexer, or the output from an IRD. If an IRD is just outputting a complete MPTS, whatever it's downlinking from satellite, then it will provide an MPTS with maybe 10 or 11 or 12 services inside. Now, we can't, without the service view, we cannot show the individual services. Of course, we can look into the probe and we can do all of the IP layer measurements, the transport layer measurements on the MPTS at the IP level, and then we can do MPEG transport stream analysis with ETR 290, and we can look at tables and services there. But we can't extract those services and put them into a view like this. The only way of doing this is by adding the service view. So the service view extracts the service names and it adds them to the service view overall view and adds a micro timeline. Now, without the service view, you can't see any of this. Now, there are a couple of provisos that should be mentioned. In order for this to work, then an MPTS must be assigned an ETR engine full-time, because if you round robin an MPTS through an ETR engine, then when it's not being analysed, this data disappears. And the other thing that you must be aware of is if I've got, let's just say for example, let's just select, because these are 4 satellite streams here, let's just assume that they're in an MPTS. They may not be, but just for the training, let's just assume that this is one MPTS. Now what will happen is I can see the 4 different services: ADB Basic, ADB PVR, ADB Zapper, and ADB MTS. So we're seeing all of those individual services. However, the micro timeline is showing the overall stream status. So it's basically showing whether I've had an error in the stream, not the individual service. So if I do get an error in ADB basic, then that error will show on all of the micro timelines. If I go into micro ADB Zapper, then I will actually see the individual errors. So that's just something to be aware of with the service view. Because the analysis is done at the stream level, not at the service level. So that's why the micro timeline reflects the stream information rather than the service information. But of course the service information is still available at the probe level itself. Okay, so we've actually looked at licenses. That was the next thing on my agenda, but we've looked at licenses. But while I'm here, it just follows exactly the same route that upgrading the license in a probe does. You send the hardware key and the system ID, and you get a new license key, and you add that key here. Of course, we're moving towards an online license model where it can be done online. One of the training modules I'm going to be doing is about licensing, because it is confusing and how licenses work, especially with the addition now of the online licensing management. There is a bit of confusion, so that will be dealt with in this upcoming video, I hope. When we look at the system, I'm going to go through all of these because I'm not going to go through all of these because I just want to highlight a few key areas. So best practice, getting to know this particular area. I don't know whether you noticed, but if I make that a bit smaller again, right down the bottom it said one process stopped, and that alarm's been on this VBC for quite a while now. And by going to About and System, I can actually see what that process is. Well, it's one of the RDW. It is the RDW process or service. So this is not running. So the RDW, the remote data wall, won't work properly. In fact, it is working, but there are some issues with it. Now, I haven't gone in and rebooted the VBC, and it's quite a nice teaching aid to show you that this is a very useful tool. If you are seeing issues with the VBC, one of the places you want to look at is here. And there are some other things here. The disk free on these particular areas of the Linux system, Opt, BTEC, VBC, and the Temp. So basically we can have a look and see how much disk is free. For example, the VBC was running slowly, or we were having problems with alarm logs or something like that. It might be worth looking in here. If the VBC is slow in responding, then it might be worth just checking the response time by clicking on that button there. Suspending alarms and measurements, again, not something you would see very often. You probably wouldn't be going there very often, but if you suspend the VBC, then it doesn't stop the VBC working, but it will stop alarms and measurements being added to the database. So VBC will still run, but alarms will eventually clear. We'll deal with this when we look at alarms, the alarm window, the reset window. So after minutes and hours, then the alarms will eventually all disappear. And you can just unclick that and restart it all again. I'm going to just show you alarm setup. I just want to draw your attention to a couple of areas here. Firstly, you can decide the severity of individual alarms here. And these windows and reset, the alarm window and the alarm reset time, do not change these numbers unless you know exactly what you're doing. Basically, this is to be used in conjunction with individual probe and the way the probes respond to the VBC. But this part of the VBC decides how the VBC responds to every probe globally. So do not change these without a thorough understanding of what you're doing. The next live session I'm going to be doing will be on VBC and probe alarms, and that will take us through in greater detail what these windows, the alarm window and the reset window actually mean. There are 3 links which are always on the VBC. They're also in our downloadable from the website, of course, but this is a handy place to get them. They're PDF manuals, and if you haven't downloaded them, I suggest, and you want some light reading for the next 5 hours, download these probes. No, being serious for a moment, these are very good manuals and they will help you. They will, in fact, more than help you, they will actually enable you to understand how probe alarms work, how VBC alarms work, and how those interact together. So I certainly recommend that you download those and have a look at them. If you don't read them straight away, at least you have them. So we look briefly at the equipment page. This is where, when you first set up a VBC, this is where you assign probes. Now, if you're setting up an individual probe, then you may remember from one of the previous training sessions, you do have to set the probe to be discoverable. It's not an automatic process. In fact, it's almost not automatic at all, because you have to enable the probe to be auto-discovered. You have to add the name of the VBC or its IP address. Then within about 5 minutes, the VBC will discover the probe. Or you can add them manually, of course. You just add them with an add a new device, and up comes all of the information for adding an individual device manually. Give it a name that means something. Are we using do we use HTTP? And of course now, since the last release of software 5.5, we've supported HTTPS. So in some environments, HTTPS is preferred. Port 80, don't normally change that. And then of course you give it to a site. Remember, a site can have more than one probe, doesn't have to have a single probe. And of course you've seen that sites don't have to have any probes. They're not particularly useful if they don't have a probe. But the system does enable you to set a site up without a probe in it. And if you don't assign a probe to a site, then it will come up automatically as unassigned. Right, so we've added equipment. There are other things we can see. We could see our unassigned devices if we did that. We could see just our VB288 extractors if I do that. Probes, minus extractors, disabled, enabled, etc. So again, that's a filtering device to enable you to see what probes are where. We can delete and we can edit, and we can export this as a CSV file. And there are some configuration links down here, so we can copy device configurations between devices. We can copy software licenses and software and license management from device to device. Well, we can't actually copy the license. We can manage them, but we can't copy them, of course, because the licenses themselves are unique to a device. But this enables me to use the VBC as like a central repository for configurations. So I don't have to load them down onto a laptop, although you can still do that, of course, from the probe itself. But you can maintain a library on the VBC of device configurations and software releases. So if where are we, managed? So if we can see here, we have a list of probe software, extractor software. So there are config files, the Ethernet stream list from one device. So you can see that this gives you a central point for managing software and configuration files. Reports. I'm going to look at reports quickly. So let's just say you want to set up an auto report. Now, the first thing to remember, and you probably already know this because I did mention it during the VBC walkthrough last time, reports are divided into two. There are effectively the IP reports for IP and OTT, and then the extended reports, which then look beyond the IP into the ETR 290 and the RF type errors that occur on probes themselves. And you know that you can generate a manual report at any time over any period of time, recording any sites and any streams. So it is very, very customizable how you generate a report. But one of the really good features are these auto reports. So we can generate a daily report, and we can generate a weekly report on any day of the week, and we can generate a monthly report on any day of the month. we can't actually change the time. What are we going to do with these reports? Okay, they sit in the database waiting to be downloaded, but why not send them to someone? This is very useful. Send them to a string of email recipients. So you can just add any number of email recipients there and they will get these auto reports. You do need to set up, I can't remember exactly where it is. I think it's in, no, it's in general. If we want to set up a automatic emailing, then we need to set up a going mail server, of course, and that's where it's set up in main and general. So going back to reports and auto reports, we set them up. Now we can actually say, what do we want this report to include? And that is what the daily report would include, were it to be actually instituted. Of course, it's not enabled. We can actually edit the daily report, and do we say which sites, and as you can see, every single site that we have is recorded in this auto report. All streams, yes, we want all streams, and we want IPTV only. So we're not doing, for the daily report, we're not doing any OTT. And it will be user defined because it's a daily report. These numbers down here refer to things like for an SLA, a service level agreement. So if your service level agreement is 99.99, then that's where you put it in. Availability is defined as amount of no signal that a stream has had over the period of time in question. No signal is defined by default as 1,000 milliseconds. So in other words, 1 second without multicast packets. Any greater gap than that between multicast packets will generate a no signal error. That can be user change. You could change it to 2 seconds if you wanted to, but it's set default at 1 second. So availability is defined as no signal. Quality is defined by dropped packets, in other words, dropped transport stream packets, because as we know from previous training, that if we drop a transport stream packet, then that can affect the video or audio quality. And the timing is defined by IP jitter. So the more jitter we have, the more the timing goes out. So we can do the same for the monthly report, the weekly report and the monthly report as well. But we can also generate a manual report. So we go back to generate a manual report and we can do exactly the same. We can select just the streams for training, and you can see that we've selected the VB330 site, the VB120 site. But this could just as easily be, I just want, if my sites were set up geographically, for example, I might just want my Oslo sites. I just want the probes in Oslo. I want to generate a report for just the probes in Oslo. Extended reports, slightly more complicated, exactly the same type of setup. In other words, you decide whether you want, which sites you want in your daily, weekly, monthly or manual report. But then down here we select which parameters we want the report to show. You can see that we have a default set of checks that are added, and you can see there's a whole load of checks there, mainly around well, there's things like media loss rate, inter-arrival time, but there are also things like PTS errors. So these are MPEG transport stream errors. So we can use this default, or we could delete some of those. Let's go down. So we could delete those groups, those checks, and we could add our own checks. So I could actually say we'll add a group, we'll call that group called training. So we'll add a group called training. We just want to do our ETR priority. Oops, I need to go down to the bottom. We just want to add our ETR priority 1 alarms, and there they are. They'll appear there. But I might also just want my PCR there as well. So we'll add that. So you can basically tune your extended report to anything you want. Now the only thing about this is I've added a new group, but it's not a permanent addition, so I can't recall that. and which streams and which services, because remember we've got the service view option. And we've only got one threshold, and that's for all, basically that's for all parameters. Most of these tests are binary on, off, pass, fail. Okay, so that's reports gone through. Again, remember the manuals. I mention that every single time. The manuals are very useful. They're quite explanatory. They're readable as well, and they're also searchable, which is nice. So they're PDF files. You can search for reports and just go straight to the reports page. So something that's been added recently, or fairly recently, to VBC is snapshots. Snapshots enable you to take a snapshot, quite literally, of the VBC and probes. So it's a bit like a restore point on a Windows PC. You know, you can set these restore points before you upgraded your software, just in case you needed to go back. Well, we can do the same thing with VBC. We can take a snapshot of the VBC. In fact, the automatic snapshots are taken every day. In fact, the snapshots occur every day anyway. I think it's around about midnight. You can't set the time, but it happens every day. And they're kept for 30 days, and then after 30 days they're deleted. So you have the last 30 days. But I can take a manual snapshot now if I wanted to. And this is a really good idea. If I was doing some maintenance on the VBC, maybe I was doing some changes or something like that, then it's a really good idea to take a snapshot now. And that snapshot will enable you to go back to a previous state should you need to, for any reason at all. So use snapshots. They maintain a snapshot of the VBC state and all of the probe's config. Not the alarms, not the measurements from the probe, just the configs. So, well, my next thing on my menu was the upgrade, but we've already done that. Sorry, we did licenses. But to upgrade the VBC itself is here. So again, it's pretty similar to the way that the probes work. You just upgrade the software and away it goes. Of course, the difference between the VBC and a probe is that an individual probe will reboot, and that monitoring data for the probe will be lost. If you upgrade the VBC, then the VBC will reboot, and for that period of time will stop monitoring all of the probes. The probes will still be working independently, but the VBC itself will stop working for that period of time. It's not particularly long, but it's something that you should be aware of. Now I'm going to just go through a couple of options that are not part of the VBC as standard, just because they're available and they're on this particular VBC, so we may as well have a look at them. We are getting towards the last quarter of the training session, so I will go through them fairly quickly. The graphics option enables users to generate their own graphics view. Now, the way I explain this, the simplest, is it's basically like a cut down version of Data Miner. And by cut down, I mean it only deals with the alarms generated by the VBC and the probes. Of course, Data Miner is far more wide-ranging than that. But the point is that this enables the users to generate their own graphics and then map alarms from streams, from probes, onto those graphics. And the graphics are created fairly simply with something like an Illustrator or Visio. Many people understand Visio. There's also a free vector generating application called Inkscape. So these are all vector graphics. And it enables you to map, so we can see some alarms. We don't see any alarms because everything's green, but I can actually, if I want to have a look at the probe that's associated with my satellite, I can click on my satellite, and this shows me all. This then goes down another level to another graphic that I've designed and mapped, and I can see individual satellite transponders from individual satellite cards in my probes. And I can even, if I want to, I can even add things like individual services. coming into that particular IRD at that particular time. Well, of course, by IRD I mean this probe that happens to be monitoring the output of that IRD. Or maybe it's an RF probe, and that RF probe is actually monitoring the satellite downlink itself as well. And were BBC World to go into error, then I could generate an alarm, and then that would turn BBC World yellow or orange, depending on the type of error. So it's very, very flexible. It's not a trivial matter to set up, but once you've started, we do have a completely free manual and a step-by-step guide on how to set this up. Bridgetech also offer a service, but it's a chargeable service, and we will set this up for you if you wish. But it is something that there's always someone in an organisation, there's always someone who's working there who thinks, oh yeah, I'd like to do that, and they'll get stuck in. And using the manual, they can develop some very sophisticated graphics. And these again are web pages, so this web page can be delivered over the network, so anyone can see this web page. Now the other thing I wanted to look at is the RDW. Remember, we saw this stop process down the bottom, and we found out that it was an RDW process that had stopped. But that doesn't stop us looking at it. So again, I'm going to do an entire training session on the remote data wall. I was going to say it's complex. It's actually quite simple, but it's very, very sophisticated. It relies on canvases, which we're looking at now, and canvases are user defined. You can have as many canvases as you want. So I could select, let me just select something that someone's already designed or in the process of designing. So we can add thumbnails, we can add widgets, we can add alarms, we can add URLs from external websites, we can add all sorts of different things like clocks. And this is a countdown timer, and the countdown timer is now in the red because we're 444 days since the countdown timer zeroed. So that's an awful long time that this has been up. But I can configure that. There's the deadline, in fact. So I can actually set the deadline to, let's see if I can set the deadline to something else. No, I can't. There we are. Let's set it to Christmas Day. So I can set that to Christmas Day. There we go. And now it's actually not, it's 29 days and 1 hour to Christmas Day. So this is a countdown timer that can be used for, we can give it a title and so on and so forth, move it around, change the size. We can do the same with thumbnails. We can move these thumbnails. Oh, that's not thumbnail. That's actually that's the audio bar. You can see that's the audio bar associated with this thumbnail, but I can change the thumbnail, make it smaller, bigger, move it anywhere I want. So very, very flexible. We can have an unlimited number of canvases. So if you've got a large system with a lot of probes, this could be really quite useful. For example, if we look at the satellite ingress, so we can see we've changed the background color to something grey, something nice. We can see a constellation diagram from one probe, a constellation diagram from another. We can see a thumbnail, and we can see things like carrier to noise ratio, modulation error rate, and even a clock that's sitting there. And if I want to see what that looks like in real time, then I can just click on this little button here, and that will show me. And then I associate that particular canvas to a device. Now, it wouldn't make much sense to associate this particular canvas to something like a smartphone because it would be quite small. So I would then develop a canvas specifically for a smartphone. So it's very powerful, and we'll have a whole session on that. Okay, so that's the remote data wall, and we'll also look at timeline very quickly. Again, we're going to do another full setup on timeline. It's not really a license for the archive server. The archive server is the physical device that you add to the VBC. So it's basically another server. And depending on how big the disk space is for that server, depends on how much you can store and for how long. So the bigger the server and the bigger the disk space, then the longer you can store streams and services. So once you add that, once you bought the server, or then that becomes an option that's added to VBC. And the menu item is called timeline because it is a timeline. I can go anywhere in the last 3 months. That's the way this one's set up. So I could go back to October the 23rd at 1700 and I could see there's 1700 there. So I could see how my stream was behaving at 1700. If I actually pick something that's got any pictures on it, it'll be a bit more interesting. So I can add a thumbnail, so I can select these thumbnails and I can download them. I should have gone back to now. So we could add things like loudness graphs. Things like MOS scores, QoE. So you can see how this works. We can scrub up and down, so very easy to find whether pictures aired, a particular spot aired, and whether we had some audio silence, whether the captions disappeared. All of this sort of data is contained in the archive server. So that's a quick look at those 3 subsystems of the VBC. Thanks very much for joining me, and I hope that you found this useful and that you'll attend the next training course on alarm setup.